She had always believed that love was something you proved quietly, through years of consistency rather than grand gestures. And that belief was what carried Margaret through decades of early mornings, scraped knees, school lunches packed with care, and sleepless nights spent listening for footsteps in the hallway. Because from the moment the baby was placed in her arms, small and fragile and already carrying a story she didn't fully know, she decided that whatever questions existed about the past would never matter more than the life unfolding in front of her. And as the years passed, she became the only mother the child ever remembered, the one who attended every recital, every parent-teacher meeting, every difficult conversation about growing up and fitting in, never once suspecting that the truth she was protecting so fiercely was not the truth she had been given, but one carefully hidden from her. And on that quiet afternoon, as she sorted through old documents she had kept more out of habit than necessity, Margaret had no idea that a single misplaced envelope, yellowed with age and nearly forgotten, was about to undo a lifetime of certainty and force her to question not just the past, but the meaning of everything she believed motherhood had given her. At first, Margaret told herself it was nothing more than an administrative mistake, the kind that happens when paperwork passes through too many hands over too many years. And yet her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded the brittle document again, rereading the unfamiliar name printed where she had always assumed her own should be, because something inside her recognized the weight of the moment even before her mind was ready to accept it. And as she sat at the kitchen table where so many ordinary conversations had taken place, she felt the strange sensation of time collapsing inward, memories resurfacing with a sharpness she hadn't felt in years. Small moments she had dismissed long ago suddenly rearranging themselves into a pattern that no longer felt accidental. The unanswered questions from the adoption agency, the rushed explanations, the way certain details were always gently redirected whenever she asked too much. And now, surrounded by the quiet hum of a house filled with decades of shared life, Margaret realized that the truth had not been hidden to protect the child alone, but to keep her from asking the one question that now echoed relentlessly in her mind. Who was the woman who gave birth, and why had the truth waited so long to find its way back to her, just as she had begun to believe that her story and the choices she made were finally settled? That night, sleep refused to come, not because Margaret was afraid, but because her mind would not stop reconstructing the past with this new piece finally placed at its center. And as she lay awake, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around her, she realized how many decisions in her life had quietly bent around an absence she never knew existed. How many moments of doubt she had swallowed without question because she believed uncertainty was simply part of love. And now, with the truth pressing against her thoughts, she began to see how carefully the silence had been maintained, not through cruelty, but through convenience, through the belief that some truths were better postponed indefinitely. And yet, what unsettled her most was not the deception itself, but the realization that her instincts had sensed it all along, that subtle feeling she had ignored every time something didn't quite add up, every time she accepted reassurance instead of answers. And as the hours passed, she felt a slow but undeniable shift inside her, a movement away from confusion and toward something steadier, because for the first time she was no longer trying to protect anyone else's version of events. She was allowing herself to want clarity, even if that clarity threatened to rearrange everything she thought she knew about her family, her past, and the woman she had become by believing a story that was never complete. That night, sleep refused to come. Not because Margaret was afraid, but because her mind would not stop reconstructing the past with this new piece finally placed at its center. And as she lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around her, she realized how many decisions in her life had quietly bent around an absence she never knew existed, how many moments of doubt she had swallowed without question because she believed uncertainty was simply part of love. And now, with the truth pressing against her thoughts, she began to see how carefully the silence had been maintained, not through cruelty, but through convenience, through the belief that some truths were better postponed indefinitely. And yet, what unsettled her most was not the deception itself, but the realization that her instincts had sensed it all along. That subtle feeling she had ignored every time something didn't quite add up, every time she accepted reassurance instead of answers. And as the hours passed, she felt a slow but undeniable shift inside her, a movement away from confusion and toward something steadier, because for the first time, she was no longer trying to protect anyone else's version of events. She was allowing herself to want clarity, even if that clarity threatened to rearrange everything she thought she knew about her family, her past, and the woman she had become by believing a story that was never complete. As the day progressed, Margaret felt an unfamiliar tension settle beneath her calm exterior. Not panic, but the weight of knowing that the answers she was seeking would inevitably change more than just her understanding of the past. And as she reflected on the years spent raising the child she had always called her own, she realized how deeply her identity had been shaped by that role, how many sacrifices she had made willingly, believing they were grounded in a shared truth. And now the possibility that her devotion had been built on an omission forced her to reconsider not the love she gave, but the context in which it was received. And this realization stirred a quiet grief that had nothing to do with loss and everything to do with recognition, because she understood that love does not become less real when truth emerges, but it does become more complex. And as she sat alone in the late afternoon light, she found herself rehearsing conversations that had not yet happened, imagining explanations she might hear, apologies that might come too late, and questions that could never be fully answered. Yet, beneath all of it, she sensed a growing strength, a steadiness that came from finally allowing herself to acknowledge that her experience mattered independently of how the story had been framed for her. And in that moment, she accepted that whatever truths awaited her were not a threat to the life she had lived, but an invitation to see it more clearly, to hold both love and honesty without diminishing either, and to step forward no longer defined solely by what she had been given, but by what she now chose to understand. That evening, as the house settled into its familiar quiet, Margaret found herself thinking less about the secret itself and more about the years built around it, years defined by routine, responsibility, and a deep sense of purpose she had never questioned. And she realized how profoundly motherhood had shaped her, not just through the acts of care and sacrifice, but through the identity it had given her, the certainty that she belonged at the center of someone else's life. And now the possibility that this bond had been framed by a truth withheld from her did not erase the love she felt, but it did force her to confront how little choice she had been given in defining that role. And as she sat with this awareness, she began to understand that the deepest wound was not deception, but exclusion. The knowledge that decisions affecting the course of her life had been made without her consent. And this realization stirred a quiet anger she had rarely allowed herself to feel, not explosive or destructive, but steady and clarifying. And rather than pushing it away, she let it exist, recognizing it as a signal that her boundaries had been crossed long ago. And as the night deepened, she sensed a shift within herself, a movement away from self-doubt and towards self-respect, because she could now see that seeking the truth was not an act of betrayal toward the child she loved, but an act of honesty toward herself. And in that clarity, she felt prepared for what lay ahead, knowing that the next step would require courage, not to accuse or demand, but to finally ask the questions she had been discouraged from asking for far too long. The next morning brought a quiet determination Margaret had not felt before. not rushed or emotional, but grounded in the understanding that avoiding the truth had already cost her more than facing it ever could. And as she prepared herself for the day, she realized how carefully she had learned to live within the limits set by others, accepting partial explanations because they preserved harmony, never stopping to ask who that harmony truly served. And now, with the knowledge pressing steadily against her awareness, she felt an unfamiliar confidence taking shape, one that did not rely on certainty of outcome, but on the clarity of intention. And as she revisited old conversations in her mind, she noticed how often her questions had been gently redirected, how reassurance had replaced transparency, and instead of feeling foolish for not seeing it sooner, she felt compassion for the woman she had been, understanding that trust is not weakness, but a willingness to believe in shared responsibility. And as the day unfolded, she began to consider what truth might change and what it could not, recognizing that no document or revelation could undo the years of love, care, and presence she had given. Yet it could redefine how she carried those years forward. And in that reflection, she understood that the next conversation would not be about reclaiming the past, but about reclaiming agency, about asserting that her life, her role, and her devotion deserved honesty from the beginning. And as she stood at the threshold of that realization, Margaret felt steady rather than afraid, aware that whatever answers awaited her would no longer determine her worth, because she was finally prepared to stand fully inside her own truth. As the days passed, Margaret began to notice how the smallest moments now carried a different weight. Not because anything dramatic had happened, but because she was finally allowing herself to see patterns she had ignored for years. The pauses in conversations, the familiar deflections, the way certain memories were always retold with missing pieces. And this awareness did not arrive with shock or anger, but with a slow, unsettling clarity that reshaped how she understood her past. And as she revisited old conversations in her mind, she realized how often she had chosen reassurance over truth, how often she had accepted explanations simply because questioning them felt too exhausting. And this realization brought both grief and relief. Grief for the time spent protecting a version of reality that kept her comfortable, and relief in knowing that her instincts had never been wrong, only postponed. And while she did not yet know what she would do with this understanding, she felt herself standing more firmly inside it, no longer rushing to resolve the discomfort or soften its edges, allowing uncertainty to exist without immediately turning it into forgiveness or denial. And in this quiet internal shift, Margaret understood that something irreversible had already begun. Not a confrontation or a decision, but a reclaiming of her own perspective. A subtle yet profound movement away from self-doubt and toward self-trust. And although the answers she sought were still incomplete, she sensed that the most important change was not what she would learn next, but how differently she would listen, respond, and choose from this point forward. That evening, Margaret sat alone with the quiet hum of the house around her, noticing how silence no longer felt empty but observant, as if it were giving her space to hear her own thoughts without interruption. And she reflected on how change rarely arrives as a single dramatic moment, but instead unfolds through a series of small recognitions that slowly alter how one stands in the world. And as she replayed recent conversations, she became aware of how differently she was responding now, no longer filling pauses with reassurance or explaining away discomfort, allowing questions to remain unanswered without feeling the need to resolve them immediately. And this shift unsettled her at first because it removed the familiar structure she had relied on for years. Yet, beneath that unease, there was a growing steadiness, a sense that she was no longer negotiating with her own intuition. And while nothing externally had been confronted or resolved, internally, she felt herself drawing clearer boundaries around what she would accept, what she would question, and what she would no longer excuse.
And as the night deepened, she realized that this stage was not about action or confrontation, but about preparation, about strengthening her ability to remain grounded even when truths emerge slowly or imperfectly. And in acknowledging this, she understood that patience, once mistaken for avoidance, was now becoming discernment, and that this discernment would guide whatever steps came next, even if their shape was not yet fully visible.
The morning Margaret finally chose to speak, she did so without rehearsing or bracing herself, because what she carried was no longer raw emotion, but clarity shaped by time. And as she sat across from him, she noticed how ordinary the setting appeared. A familiar room, familiar gestures. Yet everything within her had quietly shifted, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, not softened by fear nor sharpened by accusation, simply steady, stating what she had come to understand, rather than asking him to explain what she already knew. And as he responded with fragments of justification, regret, and carefully chosen words, she recognized how little power those explanations held now, not because they were false, but because they arrived too late to rewrite the truth she had already accepted. And in that moment, she realized that closure does not always come from agreement or apology, but from the refusal to continue carrying uncertainty on someone else's behalf. And while there was sadness in acknowledging what could never be restored, there was also relief in no longer negotiating with doubt. And as the conversation ended without resolution or drama, she felt something quieter take its place, a sense of release that did not require validation. And as she stepped away, she understood that healing would not erase the past, but would finally allow it to sit where it belonged, behind her rather than within her. And with that understanding, she moved forward not with certainty about the future, but with trust in her ability to face it honestly, which, after everything, felt like freedom.